In a village where the air always smelled of salt and the old wooden boats creaked a familiar rhythm, lived a young fisherman named Caleb. The sea was more than just his workplace. It was a part of his very soul. He understood its moods, its whispered secrets, the silent language of the clouds, and the hidden currents that carved the underwater world. Caleb's confidence was a thing of legend in the village. He never relied on luck or a higher power. He put his faith in the calluses on his hands and the strength in his back. He'd watch the older folk pray before they went to sea, their faces etched with a humble fear, and he'd feel a quiet sense of superiority. To Caleb, prayer was a comfort for those who couldn't master their own fate. He believed his destiny was a fishing line, cast and controlled by his own hand. One particular morning, the ocean lay still and peaceful, a vast silver mirror beneath a sky painted in soft strokes of pink and gold. It was a perfect, almost divine scene. Caleb's heart swelled with a familiar mix of anticipation and avarice. He cast his nets, the nets that had provided for his family for generations, and pulled them back heavy with the shimmering bounty of the sea. It was a haul beyond his wildest dreams. Other boats, sensing a subtle shift in the wind, a quiet warning in the air, began to turn back towards the safety of the harbor. But the sight of the overflowing nets, the promise of wealth, was a siren's call Caleb couldn't resist. Just one more, he promised himself, his voice a low whisper against the rising wind. Just one more cast. He ignored the gnawing dread, the darkening horizon, and the first rumble of thunder. He thought he was defying the storm, but in his pride and greed, he had already invited it in. As the day aged, a profound shift took place. The gentle breeze that had been his companion gave way to a biting, howling wind. The sun, once a sex's expanse of the ocean, and the crushing darkness of the sky. The terror was overwhelming, a paralyzing weight that settled in his bones. The arrogance he had nurtured his entire life vanished, replaced by a suffocating sense of helplessness. His hands, once his source of pride, were now trembling and useless against the sea's might. He screamed, his voice raw and thin against the roar of the wind, a desperate, animalistic cry for help. He yelled for anyone, for another fisherman, for a lighthouse keeper. But the only reply was the ocean's deafening, thunderous applause. He was completely alone, a tiny speck of flesh and bone against the infinite wrath of nature. His mind raced, replaying every moment of his life, every selfish choice, every word of contempt he had uttered towards those who sought comfort in faith. He looked at the waves, each one a mountain of liquid darkness, threatening to swallow him. He was no longer the master of the sea. He was its victim. All his confidence, all his self-reliance, was meaningless in the face of this power. He felt a profound, bone-deep loneliness, the kind that only comes when you realize you have no one to turn to, no one to cry out to, and nowhere left to run. The boat, groaning and creaking, was now beginning to surrender, water seeping in through the cracks. The end felt terrifyingly near, and Caleb, the man who had always stood so tall, was brought to his knees by a force far greater than his own. The storm, now a living, breathing monster, descended upon Caleb with a terrible roar. The sky was no longer a canvas, it was a crushing weight of black and grey. The waves, no longer just choppy swells, became towering walls of water, each one threatening to swallow his small boat whole. The boat, groaned and shuddered, a pitiful protest against the ocean's fury. It was a symphony of chaos, the shriek of the wind, the deafening thunder, and Shet, Meta, Sex 0.05. Truly and completely alone. In that terrifying isolation, a profound sense of despair settled over him. He was a man who had always believed in himself, in his own power. But now he saw the truth. He was nothing more than a speck in a vast, indifferent ocean. The icy water that now filled his boat was a physical manifestation of his hopelessness. The boat, his pride and joy, was dying, and he knew he would soon follow. He closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in surrender, bracing for the final wave that would wash him away forever. He had nothing left, no boat, no nets, no compass, and most importantly, no pride. The world had been stripped down to its bare, brutal truth, and he was faced with his own mortality in a way he had never imagined. The silence of his own mind, the terrifying lack of an answer, was worse than the storm itself. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the end was near. The sea didn't just rage, it swallowed. Wave after wave, a relentless assault of salt water and fury, crashed over the boat. Caleb, his body battered and his spirit broken, clung to the splintering wood, his knuckles white with a grip born of sheer desperation. He watched, horrified, as his life's work vanished into the churning abyss. First, the nets, his pride and his livelihood, were ripped from his grasp, their vibrant green fading into the monochrome chaos. Then, the small, trusted compass, his guide and his comfort, was torn from its mount and swallowed by a rogue wave, a cruel metaphor for his lost direction. He was no longer a fisherman. He was a shipwrecked man, a fragile piece of flotsam in an unforgiving world. Terror, raw and animalistic, seized him. It was a cold, suffocating presence that crept into his very bones. The fear of death was a heavy cloak, but the chilling realization of his own helplessness was a far more profound dread. His self-reliance, his arrogance, shattered into a million pieces. He saw the true stash meta, Ozer bit at 82, sex 0.05. The world had been stripped down to its bare, brutal truth, and he was faced with his own mortality in a way he had never imagined. The silence of his own mind, the terrifying lack of an answer, was worse than the storm itself. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the end was near. His lungs burned, a desperate, silent plea for air. His body, bruised and battered, was on the brink of giving up. The ocean, a cold, dark monster, seemed ready to drag him into its depths. His mind, once so proud and confident, was now a whirlwind of regret and sorrow. He saw a flash of his mother's face, her hands clasped in prayer, her eyes filled with a peace he had never understood. The memory was so vivid, so real, it was as if she were standing right there on the boat with him. She had always told him that when the world failed you, when your own strength was not enough, there was a power far greater, a love that would never fail. She had always prayed for his safe return, her quiet faith a constant, unspoken blessing over his life. In that moment, a flicker of something new ignited within him, a tiny ember of hope in the vast darkness of his despair. It was not the kind of hope born of self-reliance, but one born of utter, complete desperation.
He had no strength left, no cunning, no worldly tool to save him. All he had was the memory of his mother's faith and the chilling, undeniable feeling of his own helplessness. With the last of his strength, he looked up through the stinging rain, past the dark, menacing clouds, towards a sky he had always taken for granted. For the first time in his life, he didn't call out to the wind, or to another man, or to his own strength. He cried out to a name he had once mocked.
Shit. Meta. Sex 0.05. But in surrender to a hope far greater than any he had ever known. In that final, desperate moment, with the boat groaning its last protest against the sea, Caleb had nowhere else to turn. His hands, raw and bleeding from clinging to the splintered wood, could no longer hold on. His legs, weak and trembling, could no longer support him. His pride, the very foundation of his life, had been utterly destroyed. He was stripped bare, a man with nothing left to rely on but his own brokenness. And in that void, in that terrifying moment of surrender, a flicker of his mother's faith returned to him, not as a gentle memory, but as a burning, undeniable truth. He saw the hypocrisy of his life, the arrogance of his heart, and he knew that the only way to be saved was to give up control. He didn't know the words. He didn't know how to pray. He just knew that he had to try. He looked up, his eyes stinging from the salt spray and the lashing rain, and he screamed into the chaotic sky. "Jesus," he cried out, his voice a raw, desperate whisper swallowed by the storm. "If you are real, please save me. I have nothing left. Please." It wasn't a rehearsed prayer, but a confession. It was a cry for mercy from a man who had never believed he needed it. He didn't ask for the storm to stop. He didn't ask for a new boat. He just asked to be saved, to be rescued from the spiritual drowning that was far more terrifying than the physical one. And in that moment, something shifted. The thunder still roared, the waves still crashed, but the terror that had consumed him for hours began to recede. A profound and inexplicable peace settled over him. A warm, quiet stillness in the center of the hurricane. The one of fear and hopelessness had completely disappeared. It was as if an invisible hand had reached down, not to pull him from the water, but to steady his boat and his soul. He felt the change first in the wind. It was still screaming, but it was no longer random. It was a consistent, powerful force that, instead of tearing at his small craft, seemed to be gently but deliberately nudging it in a single direction. The waves still crashed, but they no longer felt like a personal attack. They were just part of the world around him, a force to be navigated, not a monster to be feared. The silence of his own mind, a terrifying emptiness just moments ago, was now filled with a quiet certainty. He was no longer alone. He had called out to Jesus, and Jesus had answered. Caleb, the man who had always prided himself on his own skills and knowledge, now clung to the broken pieces of his boat with a newfound faith. He wasn't navigating by a compass or the stars. He was navigating by a feeling, an inner guidance. He felt a profound sense of trust, a belief that he was being led to a safe harbor, even though he couldn't see it. He began to whisper prayers of thanks, not of desperation. He thanked God for the storm, for the despair, for the lost nets and the broken compass, because it was only in losing everything that he had found something far more valuable. He had found his faith. He was still in the belly of the beast, still at the mercy of the ocean, but he felt an unshakable peace that went beyond all understanding. He was a survivor now, not because of his own strength, but because of a power far greater than his own. And he knew, with a certainty that reached into the deepest parts of his soul, that he would make it. He was being guided, and all he had to do was hold on and trust. The world around him was still a scene of unimaginable violence, but the peace within Caleb's heart. The storm raged on, but Caleb was finally, truly safe. The sea, once his source of pride and fear, was now a testament to God's power. Caleb was no longer just a fisherman. He was a man of faith, and his journey had just begun. Caleb's faith, born from the depths of despair, was the compass he never knew he needed. The storm, which had threatened to consume him, now felt like a test, a crucible designed to strip away his pride and reveal a deeper truth. He was still adrift, a small, broken boat on an immense and violent ocean, but he felt an unshakable peace that went beyond all reason. The fear that had been a physical weight in his chest was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of awe. He had cried out to Jesus, and Jesus had answered, not by stopping the storm, but by calming the storm within his soul. He was being held, guided, and cared for by an unseen hand. The howling wind was no longer a threat. It was a powerful force, and he could feel it gently but deliberately nudging him in a single, consistent direction. He had lost his physical compass, his nets, and his boat, but he had found his spiritual direction, and it was taking him toward a safe harbor. Hours passed, a blur of wind, rain, and relentless waves. But for Caleb, time had lost its meaning. He was no longer counting the moments until his death. He was living in a state of grace, a profound and quiet joy. He had been a man who believed in the tangible, who trusted only what he could see and touch. Now, he was a man who believed in the unseen, in a love that was stronger than any storm. He began to whisper prayers of thanks, not of desperation. He thanked God for the storm, for the despair, for the lost nets and the broken boat, because it was only in losing everything that he had found something far more valuable than any worldly possession. The world was still a scene of unimaginable violence, but the peace within Caleb's heart was a fortress. The sea, once his source of pride and fear, was now a testament to God's power. He was no longer just a fisherman. He was a man of sex 0.05. A sight appeared that stole the breath from his lungs. Not a rescue boat, not a distant shore, but a small, unassuming island. It was a miracle. The storm, which had promised his death, had delivered him to a new beginning. He dragged his battered body onto the coarse sand and collapsed, his face buried in the rough earth, tears of exhaustion and gratitude mixing with the salt and rain. He was alive. When he finally lifted his head, the first thing he saw was not the palm trees or the rocks, but something else entirely. Something small, brown, and worn, half buried in the sand. He reached out with a trembling hand and pulled it free. It was a small, leather-bound book, its pages warped by the water but still intact. It was a Bible. He felt a jolt, a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a gift, a sign, a direct answer to his desperate prayer. He opened the book, his fingers tracing the ancient letters, and began to read. He read about the beginning of the world, about the lives of prophets and kings. But his heart stopped when he found the story of Jesus. He read about Jesus, not as a distant, abstract figure, but as a man who walked the earth, who healed the sick, who calmed the storms, and who taught with a love that transcended all human understanding. The words leaped off the page and into his soul. He read about Jesus feeding the multitude with a few loaves and fish, and his own stomach, empty for days, suddenly felt nourished by a different kind of food. He read about Jesus walking on water, and he remembered the terrifying power of the ocean he had just survived. He saw his own story in the scriptures, in the stories of people who were lost and found, who were broken and made whole. He had always believed that faith was a crutch for the weak, but now he saw that it was a lifeline for the broken, a source of strength that transcended human limits. He spent the next several days and nights on the island, not just surviving, but thriving on the Word of God. He ate the wild berries he found, drank from a #meta, pause, sex 0.05, and deeply personal dialogue with God. He began by simply whispering his gratitude for being alive. He thanked God for the warmth of the sun, for the sweet water from the spring, and for the wild berries that sustained him. He confessed his arrogance, his pride, and his greed, and he felt a profound sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He learned that prayer wasn't about asking for things. It was about surrendering his will to God's will. It was about listening as much as speaking. He learned to trust, to have faith, and to find peace in the quiet stillness of his heart. He read about Jesus' teachings on forgiveness, on love, and on humility, and he saw his own life in a new light. He understood that his strength and his confidence had been a form of imprisonment, a wall he had built between himself and God. The storm had broken down that wall, and now, for the first time, he was truly free. He learned to pray not just for himself, but for his family and his friends back in the village. He prayed for the other fishermen, that they would find the same peace he had found. He learned that prayer was a powerful tool, not for bending the world to his will, but for aligning his heart with God's will. He was no longer a man who believed in himself. He was a man who believed in God, and that belief had given him a strength he had never known before. He had come to the island to die, but he had found a new life, a life centered on faith, prayer, and a love that was stronger than any storm. In the lonely silence of the island, Caleb's life was a testament to his newfound faith. The storm had stripped him of everything, his boat, his livelihood, his arrogant pride, and in that emptiness, he had finally found peace. He was no longer the man who had grumbled about his fate. He was a survivor who whispered #meta, sex 0.05. He no longer felt alone on the desolate island, because he knew that Jesus was with him. He had been lost at sea, but it was there, in the middle of nowhere, that he had found the path to the true harbor of faith. Caleb had begun a new journey, a journey not of exploring the outside world, but of discovering his own inner world. With each passing day, he came to a deeper understanding of God's unconditional love and the meaning of true humility. He had learned to surrender control and let God lead the way. And in the midst of the storm's despair, he had found a great hope, a faith that would never waver. He knew that his story was not about escaping the storm, but about finding God right in the heart of it. Days melted into weeks on the island, and Caleb's life became a quiet, humble routine of survival and worship. He was no longer the man who measured his worth by the weight of his nets. He was a man who saw miracles in the most mundane moments. He had come to the island to die, but he was learning how to truly live. He found food and water, but he knew it wasn't his own strength that provided for him. With a heart full of gratitude, he knelt by a hidden spring and thanked God for its cool, sweet water. He found a small cluster of wild berries, and as he ate them, he offered a prayer of thanks for their simple nourishment. To a man who had only believed in the tangible, these were no longer just lucky finds. They were tangible proof of God's constant, loving care. He saw Jesus in every meal, in every drop of water, in the very air he breathed. He read the stories of the Bible with a hunger he had never known. The words were no longer just words on a page. They were a lifeline, a map to a new way of living. He read about the Israelites in the desert, and he saw his own journey. They were hungry and thirsty, and God provided for them, just as God was providing for him. He read about how God had protected his people from harm, and he felt a profound sense of peace. He was no longer alone. He was part of a story. But in doing so, he had gained the only thing that truly mattered, an unshakable faith. He was no longer just a man on a deserted island. He was a student in the world's most profound school, with the Bible as his textbook and the whispers of his soul as his guide. He read the stories with a newfound hunger, and each one seemed to leap off the page and speak directly to his heart. One day, he read about Jesus walking on water. The story of Jesus calmly walking on the turbulent waves to reach his disciples in their storm-tossed boat resonated with a deep, chilling truth. Caleb had faced his own storm, and he had been terrified, paralyzed by fear. He had been drowning in his own helplessness. But then, he had cried out to Jesus, and Jesus had answered, not by pulling him out of the storm, but by being with him in the storm. This was the profound realization that changed everything for Caleb. He understood that God's power wasn't just in stopping the wind and calming the seas. It was in the unseen presence, the quiet peace that could exist even in the most violent chaos. He had always believed in a God who could perform great miracles from a distance, but he had found a God who was close, who was willing to get his feet wet and walk with him through his own personal hurricane. The story of Jesus on the water was no longer just a miracle. It was a testament to a personal, intimate love. It was a promise that he would never be alone again, no matter how great the storm. He also read about Jesus and the loaves and fish, and his own stomach, empty for days, felt nourished by a different kind of food. The story of Jesus feeding the multitude with a few pieces of bread and a couple of fish spoke to his very core. He had been a man of greed, always wanting more, always fearing scarcity. Now, on this deserted island, with only a few wild berries and a bit of water to sustain him, he realized that true abundance was not about having everything, but about trusting in God's provision. He saw that God's power was not just in creating from nothing, but in multiplying the little that a person.
#meta, pause, sex. He had found a wellspring of life in the small, worn Bible, and its words quenched a thirst he hadn't even known he had. He was learning a new language, the language of faith, and it spoke to his soul in a way the ocean never had. He spent his days in quiet contemplation, reading the scriptures, and for the first time in his life, he truly prayed. Prayer wasn't a desperate plea for rescue or a magical incantation.
It was a simple, profound conversation with God. He began by whispering his gratitude for every small gift: the sweet water, the wild berries, the warmth of the sun. He confessed his past arrogance and pride, and in doing so felt a weight lift from his shoulders that had burdened him for a lifetime. He learned that prayer was not about getting what he wanted, but about surrendering to God's will and aligning his heart with a higher purpose. He read about Jesus' teachings on forgiveness, on love, and on humility, and he saw his own life in a new light. He understood that his strength and his confidence had been a wall, a self-made prison that had kept him from true peace. The storm had broken down that wall, and now, for the first time, he was truly free. He learned to pray not just for himself, but for his family and his friends back in the village. He prayed for the other fishermen, that they would find the same peace he had found. He learned that prayer was a powerful tool, not for bending the world to his will, but for aligning his heart with God's. He had come to the island to die, but he had found a new life, a life centered on faith, prayer, and a love that was stronger than any storm. On the 20th day, as Caleb knelt by the shore, his heart full of a peace he had never known, he saw a small, dark shape on the horizon. He stood up, his body weak but his spirit strong, and raised his hand. As the shape drew closer, he saw it was a fishing. He spoke of the tiny island, the Bible, and the peace he had found. The old man listened with a quiet, patient heart. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He just listened, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the old man finally said. "He doesn't always stop the storm, but he will always be with you in the storm." He offered Caleb food and water, but more importantly, he offered a fellowship of faith. They knelt together on the sand, two men from two different worlds, and prayed. Caleb thanked God for his rescue, and the old man thanked God for using him as a vessel of salvation. The sea, once a symbol of chaos and despair, was now a testament to the power of a single, heartfelt prayer. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sea of glass and a sky of brilliant blue. The old fisherman, a man named Eli, offered Caleb a place on his boat, a simple act of charity that felt like a divine appointment. As they sailed, Eli spoke of his own faith, of the times the sea had tested him, and of the prayers that had always guided him. Caleb listened with a humbled heart, seeing his own story reflected in Eli's words. He was no longer the man who had scoffed at prayer. He was a believer who understood its power. They sailed back to the village, a journey that felt shorter and more peaceful than any Caleb had ever made. The familiar sight of the harbor filled him not with a sense of triumph, but of profound gratitude. He had left in his own strength, with a boat full of nets, but he was returning in humility, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of faith. The villagers ran to the shore, their faces a mixture of shock and relief. They had given him up for dead. They had mourned his loss, convinced that the storm had taken him. But here he was, alive, a walking testament to a miracle. They asked him to tell his story, but this time Caleb did not speak of his skills as a fisherman or of Meta, now stared in disbelief. They saw a man who should have been broken,
but instead he carried a light in his eyes that was brighter than the sun. They surrounded him, their faces a mixture of relief, curiosity, and shock. "How did you survive the storm?" they clamored, their voices a wave of questions. Caleb did not speak of his skills as a fisherman, of his own resilience, or of a lucky break. He spoke of the storm, not as a brutal force of nature, but as a test from God. He spoke of his fear, his despair, and his desperate, whispered prayer. He told them about the peace that had settled in his heart, and the unseen hand that had guided him. He told them about the deserted island, the Bible he had found, and the profound love he had discovered within its pages. He spoke of his arrogance, his past pride, and how it had nearly cost him his life. But he spoke of it without shame, because it was only in admitting his brokenness that he had found a greater truth. He was no longer the confident, arrogant Caleb. He was a man transformed by faith. And his story was not about his own survival, but about God's unwavering love and mercy. The villagers, who had known Caleb the fisherman, now met Caleb the man of faith, and they saw a light in his eyes that was brighter than any sun. He had returned, not as a hero, but as a witness to a truth far greater than himself. His words were not just a story, they were a testimony, a raw and honest account of a miracle. He had lost everything, but in doing so, he had gained the only thing that truly mattered, an unshakable faith. A small crowd had gathered around Caleb, their faces a mixture of wonder and disbelief. Some whispered among themselves, their words sharp with skepticism. "It's just luck," one man muttered, a weathered fisherman named Thomas, who had lost his own boat a year ago and had never gone back to sea. "The sea takes what it wants. A prayer can't change that." Another woman, her eyes hard with a sorrow only a mother who had lost a child could know, said, "He thinks he's special. His mistakes and his near-fatal greed." "My boat was sinking," he said, his voice a whisper. "And so was I." My fear was not of drowning in the water, but of drowning in my own loneliness and despair. I had no one to turn to, nothing to believe in. So, in that final, terrifying moment, I cried out to a name I had never truly spoken before. He then described the miracle, not the calming of the storm, but the calming of his own heart. He spoke of the unshakable peace that had filled him, the quiet knowing that he was being held by a force far greater than himself. He told them about the island, the small, waterlogged Bible, and the profound, life-changing truth he had discovered within its pages. "I did not save myself," he said, his eyes filled with a humble light. "Jesus saved me. He was there, in the storm, just as he is here, with us now. My story is not about a man who survived. It is about a God who saves." The crowd was silent, their jeers and doubts forgotten. They saw the transformation in his eyes, the peace that radiated from his very being. They saw a living, breathing testament to a faith they had long since abandoned. And in his story, they saw a glimmer of hope for their own broken lives. His confession, so raw and honest, hung in the air, a silence heavier than any storm. The villagers who had come to gawk at a man they thought was a lucky fool now stood in quiet awe. Thomas, the skeptic who had lost his boat, was the first to move. He walked forward, his eyes, once hard with cynicism, now filled with a fragile, hopeful light. I lost my boat last year," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion.
I blamed God. I blamed the sea. I blamed myself. I never thought to pray again. Caleb simply nodded, his heart full of sex and the peace that had immediately filled him. He told her that her son's story was not over, that his spirit was now in a place of perfect peace. He spoke with a conviction that came not from a book, but from the depths of his own experience. His words were not a sermon, but a living, breathing testimony of a love that transcends even death. The crowd, once a group of cynics, was now a congregation of believers. They knelt, some with tears in their eyes, some with their heads bowed in prayer. They were no longer listening to Caleb the fisherman. They were listening to Caleb, the witness. His story was a living, breathing testament to a faith they had long since abandoned, and in his words they saw a glimmer of hope for their own broken lives. They had witnessed a miracle, not of nature, but of the heart. A miracle that was not about escaping a storm, but about finding a safe harbor in the arms of God. Years melted away, and Caleb became a living legend in the village. His story was told and retold, a whisper of hope carried on the salt-laden wind. He no longer fished for a living. His purpose had shifted. He spent his days sitting by the docks, not to mend nets, but to mend broken hearts and shattered faith. His gentle presence and the profound peace that radiated from him were a beacon to those who had lost their way. His former friends and neighbors, men and women who had once scoffed at his beliefs, now came to him, their hearts heavy with burdens he knew all too well. One day, an old friend named Elias came to him. Elias had been a cynical man, his faith long since shattered by a series of misfortunes and hardships. He had lost his wife, his livelihood, and his will to live. He looked at Caleb, his eyes filled with a raw, bitter pain that Caleb recognized from his own past. "Caleb," Elias said, his voice a low, rough whisper, "I've tried everything. I've worked hard. I've done everything right. But all I've found is sorrow. The world is a cruel place, and there is no God." Caleb's heart ached for him. He didn't preach a sermon. Stat meta. Pause. Ricard. 0.05. Desperate prayer, and the profound peace that had immediately filled him. He told Elias that the peace he felt wasn't because the storm had stopped. It was because he was no longer alone in it. Elias listened, his face a complex mixture of skepticism and a fragile, desperate hope. He saw the truth in Caleb's eyes, a truth that transcended all logic and reason. He saw a man who had been broken by the world, but had been made whole by something far greater. Caleb's story was not just a tale of survival. It was a living, breathing testimony. His voice, once full of pride, was now a vessel for a far greater message. He looked at his old friend Elias, a man whose face was a mirror of his own past self. Hard, cynical, and weary, with a sorrow that ran bone deep. Elias had lost everything he had believed in, and now he was drowning in a sea of hopelessness. Caleb didn't offer empty platitudes or a memorized sermon. He offered a simple, powerful truth that he had lived himself. "Elias," Caleb began, his voice low and compassionate, "I know you've lost faith. I know you feel abandoned and betrayed. I once stood in that very same place." He spoke of his own storm, of how the sea had swallowed his boat, his nets, and his pride. He spoke of the terrifying moment he realized his own strength was nothing, and he was completely alone.
I had nothing left, Caleb said, his voice a raw whisper. My body was broken, my spirit was crushed, and I felt a loneliness that was colder than the ocean itself. He then paused, his eyes holding Elias's with a profound, unwavering certainty. And in that moment, when I had nothing left, I did the only thing I could do. I surrendered. He told Elias about it.
Hashtag @meta. Pause. Sex 0.05. He didn't promise a life without storms, but a life with an anchor. A quiet, unshakable certainty that no matter what happened, you were never truly alone. Elias stood in stunned silence, his hand still in Caleb's. The words, so simple and yet so profound, echoed in the emptiness of his heart. Caleb hadn't offered him a solution, a quick fix to his pain. He had offered him something far more valuable, a different way to see the world. He had offered him hope, not in the absence of a storm, but in the presence of a loving God right in the middle of it. For years, Elias had carried his sorrow like a heavy stone, a burden he thought he had to bear alone. He had cursed the world, cursed his luck, and cursed a God he didn't believe existed. But as he looked into Caleb's eyes, he saw a peace that was real, a peace that was born not from an easy life, but from a life that had faced its worst fears and come out whole. Later that night, alone in his small, empty cottage, Elias knelt. He had not knelt in years. He didn't know what to say. His mind was a jumble of anger, resentment, and a fragile, terrifying hope. He thought of Caleb's words. Just say, Jesus, if you are real, please help me. He was a cynical man, a man who had only ever trusted in what he could see and touch. But he had nothing left to lose. The silence in the cottage was deafening, the loneliness a physical weight. He closed his eyes, and a single raw whisper escaped his lips. Jesus, if you are real, please help me. The words felt foreign, awkward, but they were honest. He didn't feel a sudden flash of light or a voice from heaven, but he did feel something else. He felt a release. The tight knot of bitterness in his stomach, the cold ache of sorrow in his chest, began to loosen. It was not a grand miracle, but a subtle, powerful shift. The loneliness was still. The profound peace that radiated from him was a beacon to the lost, the grieving, and the weary. He had become a spiritual compass for the village, a man whose faith was as solid as the rock beneath their feet. People came to him with their burdens, farmers whose crops had failed, mothers who had lost their children, young men who had lost their way. They didn't come to him for a miracle. They came to him for a message. They came to him because they saw something in his eyes that they had long since lost in their own lives. Hope. He would listen patiently, his eyes filled with compassion, and then he would tell them his story. He would speak of his arrogance, his pride, and his despair. He would describe the terrifying storm that had swallowed his boat and his life. But he would always end with the moment he had cried out to Jesus and the peace that had immediately filled him. He would tell them that God doesn't always stop the storms of life, but he promises to be with you in the middle of them. He would share the wisdom he had found on the deserted island, the lessons from the old, waterlogged Bible. He would tell them that his survival wasn't a testament to his own strength, but to the power of a single, heartfelt prayer. He became a mentor, a guide, and a father figure to the younger generation. He taught them not just how to fish, but how to live. He taught them to pray, not just for a good catch, but for a good heart. He taught them that true wealth wasn't in their nets, but in their faith. He would often sit with them on the beach, pointing out to the vast, endless ocean. The sea, he would say, his voice a low, steady rumble, is full of storms, but so is life. Don't put your trust in your boat. Don't put your trust in your nets. Put your trust in the one who can calm the storm within your soul.
Hashed at meta, pause. Sex, 0.05. I've tried everything. I've worked hard. I've done everything right. But all I've found is sorrow. The world is a cruel place, and there is no God. Caleb's heart ached for him. He didn't preach a sermon or lecture Elias on his lack of faith. He simply looked at his old friend with a deep, profound empathy. He knew that pain. He had lived with that same bitterness, that same sense of a world that had abandoned him. He reached out and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Elias," he said softly, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I don't know why we face these trials. I don't have all the answers. But I do know this. God doesn't promise to take away the pain. He promises to be with you in the pain. He promises to be your strength when you have none left." He began to tell his story, not as a glorious tale of a miraculous rescue, but as a humble, honest confession of a man who had fallen and been lifted up. He spoke of the terrifying loneliness of the storm, the feeling of being completely abandoned and helpless. He spoke of his arrogance, his pride, and the moment he hit rock bottom. And then he spoke of his one desperate prayer and the profound peace that had immediately filled him. He told Elias that the peace he felt wasn't because the storm had stopped. It was because he was no longer alone in it. Elias listened, his face a complex mixture of skepticism and a fragile, desperate hope. He saw the truth in Caleb's eyes, a truth that transcended all logic and reason. He saw a man who had been broken by the world, but had been made whole by something far greater. His hair had turned to silver. His hands were gnarled with the passing of years, and the lines on his face were a map of a life lived fully. But Caleb carried a peace that defied time. He was no longer the young, arrogant fisherman who had believed in his own strength. He was meta, sex, 0.05. "I do not regret the storm," he said, his voice a frail but steady sound. "I thank God for it. It was a crucible that burned away my pride and my foolishness. It was a journey that brought me to the one place I truly needed to be, in the arms of my Lord." He spoke of his old life, a life of arrogance and self-reliance, and he confessed his past sins without shame. "I was a rich man," he whispered, "but I was poor in spirit. I had everything I wanted, but I had nothing I needed. It was only when I had lost it all that I finally found true wealth." He spoke of the Bible he had found, the words that had come alive and given him a new purpose.
He spoke of the prayers, not as a desperate plea, but as a conversation with a loving Father. He had nothing left to fear. His life was not ending. It was coming to a beautiful, peaceful close, a final chapter in a story of faith and redemption. He had lived his life as a testament to God's unwavering love, and his death was no different. He was going home. He knew his time was near. The old fisherman, once a man of the sea, was now a man of the Spirit, and he felt a peaceful certainty about his final voyage. His family was gathered around his bed, their faces etched with a sorrow that he did not share. He looked at them, a gentle smile on his lips, and his eyes, though dim with age, were bright with a profound and unshakable peace. He had no regrets. He did not lament the lost boat, the ruined nets, or the life he had once so proudly controlled. He saw it all as a necessary journey, a brutal but beautiful path that had led him to the arms of a loving God. "My children," he whispered, his voice thin but clear, "do not mourn for me. My life is not ending. It is beginning. The storm that took my boat was a blessing, for it taught me to surrender to a power far greater than my own. The island I was stranded on was not a prison, but a sanctuary where I found the true." Started at Meta. He had lived his life as a testament to God's unwavering love, and his death was no different. He was going home, a final, beautiful journey to the safe harbor he had found so many years ago. Caleb's final breath was not an end, but a new beginning for the village he had loved and served so faithfully. His passing was not marked by despair, but by a quiet, profound peace that settled over the community. The grief they felt was not for a life cut short, but for the loss of a physical presence that had been a living, breathing testament to God's unwavering love. But his story, his legacy, was not buried with him. It was carried on the lips of every man, woman, and child who had been touched by his transformation. The arrogant fisherman had become a spiritual father, and his influence was a current that ran deeper than the sea itself. His prayers, once raw and desperate whispers in the middle of a storm, became a part of the village's spiritual DNA. People would find themselves, in moments of fear or doubt, instinctively muttering a phrase he had often used: "Jesus, if you are real, please help me." They didn't have to be on a boat in a storm to understand its power. They spoke it when a child fell ill, when a net came up empty, or when a loved one was in pain. His simple, honest prayer became a common language of faith, a shared heritage that bound the community together. Young fishermen, once as prideful as Caleb had been, now knelt on the docks before they set out, their heads bowed, not in a ritual they had been taught, but in a sincere conversation with the God they had come to know through Caleb's story. They spoke of the storm not as a cruel act of nature, but as a path to a deeper truth. The memory of his story was a living, breathing presence among them. The old men would gather around the fire and retell the tale of the foolish fisherman who found wisdom in a storm. The mothers would soothe their frightened Meta, and he'd given it freely to all who would listen. His words were a living seed, planted in the hearts of his people, and they would grow, a forest of faith in a world that so desperately needed it. His legacy was the quiet certainty that no matter what happened, a single, honest prayer was all it took to find your way home. Caleb's final breath was not an end.
but a new beginning for the village he had loved and served so faithfully. His passing was not marked by despair, but by a quiet, profound peace that settled over the community. The grief they felt was not for a life cut short, but for the loss of a physical presence that had been a living, breathing testament to God's unwavering love. But his story, his legacy, was not buried with him. It was carried on the lips of every man, woman, and child who had been touched by his transformation. The arrogant fisherman had become a spiritual father, and his influence was a current that ran deeper than the sea itself. His prayers, once raw and desperate whispers in the middle of a storm, became a part of the village's spiritual DNA. People would find themselves, in moments of fear or doubt, instinctively muttering a phrase he had often used: "Jesus, if you are real, please help me." They didn't have to be on a boat in a storm to understand its power. They spoke it when a child fell ill, when a net came up empty, or when a loved one was in pain. His simple, honest prayer became a common language of faith, a shared heritage that bound the community together. Young fishermen, once as prideful as Caleb had been, now knelt on the docks before they set out, their heads bowed, not in a ritual they had been taught, but in a sincere conversation with a God they had come to know through Caleb's story. They spoke of the storm not as a cruel act of nature, but #@meta, sex 0.05. He had left behind not wealth or fame, but a faith that was as solid and enduring as the land itself. He had found his true treasure, not in the depths of the sea, but in the depths of his soul, and he had given it freely to all who would listen. His words were a living seed planted in the hearts of his people, and they would grow, a forest of faith in a world that so desperately needed it. His legacy was the quiet certainty that no matter what happened, a single, honest prayer was all it took to find your way home. This is not just a story about a fisherman named Caleb and a storm at sea. It is a timeless, living parable, a testament to the profound and transformative power of faith. It is a message for every soul that has ever felt lost, for every heart that has ever been battered by the waves of life. The story of Caleb is your story, and the storm he faced is a metaphor for the trials and tribulations we all must endure. The message is simple, powerful, and as enduring as the sea itself. The first lesson is a warning against the arrogance of the heart. Caleb, in his pride, believed in his own strength, in the power of his calloused hands and his seasoned knowledge. He believed he was the master of his own destiny, and that faith was a crutch for the weak. But the sea, in its infinite wisdom and terrible power, showed him the truth, that our human strength is nothing more than a fragile vessel against the infinite forces of life. It is in our moments of greatest strength that we are often the most vulnerable, for our pride blinds us to the need for a power far greater than our own. Do not trust in the strength of your own hands, for they are nothing but dust. Do not put your faith in a world that can be torn apart by a single storm. Surrender your pride, for it is a heavy anchor that will only drag you down. The second lesson is about the courage of a single prayer. In his moment of utter, complete despair, Caleb had nothing left. His boat was sinking, his pride was shattered, and he was alone in a terrifying world of wind. #@meta, sex 0.05. A place where he was given a gift of salvation and a new purpose. His true home, his final destination, was not a physical place, but a spiritual one.
He found his true harbor in the arms of a loving God, a God who was willing to walk with him in the storm, a God who would never leave him or forsake him. This story is a testament to the fact that you may lose everything, your possessions, your health, your loved ones, but you can never lose your connection to a God who loves you. He is the anchor that will hold you steady when the waves of life are crashing all around you. He is the light that will guide you in the darkest night. He is the peace that will fill your heart when the world is in chaos. He is the ultimate safe harbor. So, when the storms of life inevitably come, and they will, do not be afraid. Do not rely on your own strength, for it is fragile and finite. Instead, remember the story of Caleb, the foolish fisherman who found wisdom in a storm. Close your eyes, and with all the honesty and brokenness in your heart, cry out to Jesus. He will be there. He will not always stop the storm, but he will always be with you in the storm. And in that moment, you will find a peace that transcends all understanding, a love that is stronger than any fear, and a home that is waiting for you, a safe harbor in the arms of your Lord. This is the truth. This is the final message.